Hello everybody, and thanks very much for joining me on what is the last of the ISF webinars for 2022. What I'm going to be talking about today is cyber in 2023. So those of you that normally join me on these programs each year will know that I tend to look forwards into the sorts of threats, the sorts of challenges that we can generally expect in the coming year, and then offer up some solutions, ways in which we can deal with it so that it makes everybody's life a little bit easier. Hopefully. What I'll then do is take questions at the end of it, and for those of you that are not watching this live, that are watching it in playback, you will see my contact details towards the end of the deck that I'm using, and so you can contact me either on LinkedIn, you can send me emails, you can text me. There's also a Twitter link on there, although I don't tend to use that very much anymore, like a lot of other people, I guess. So what is it that's happening in 2023? Well, let's take a look back first at last year, this year, 2022. What were the sorts of things that we saw and what will happen related to that going forward? Well, 2022 was the year that we really sort of emerged from the pandemic. We'd seen a number of changes in the way that businesses had moved to being very much more digital. We'd seen home working come in that had presented all sorts of security challenges because what little control we'd had over what was going on in the office environment really disappeared once we put people out into their home offices. We've also seen a merging of more physical and digital. So certainly within the ISF membership, we've noticed some of our Chief Information Security Officers becoming Chief Security Officers, because data is fueling some of those physical elements of business now. And those are the sorts of things certainly that I'm expecting to see continue into 2023. We're also, of course, going to see much more in terms of artificial intelligence, whether that be in the business environment or hopefully as well in the security space, because I think that really presents some opportunities for us to save on resources, to be a little bit more effective. But we'll have to wait and see. That's the good news. The bad news is that, of course, cyber criminals will continue to exploit opportunities. We will continue to see cyber being used in warfare. We've seen that particularly in the way that some of the activities have been happening in mainland Europe through the Ukraine and so on, but not just there. And again, for those of you who listen to some of my podcasts and webcasts regularly, you know I'm not a huge fan of regulation, but I do think that we're going to see very much more complex regulation evolving over the course of next year as well, which of course makes life a lot more tricky if you're looking to operate across geography. So the overall landscape, what's it going to look like? Well, I think more of what we saw in 2022 in terms of some of the working environments, more regulation, more cyber criminal activity. It all means that cybersecurity is going to become riskier, it's going to become costlier, and it's certainly going to become much more complicated for the CISOs and for businesses in general. But now let's look at some of the major issues that I see out there that we really need to, I think, prepare for in 2023. The first one will be no surprise to anybody really, it's cyber attacks. In 2021 we saw some very big names that were attacked. So this was really just an insight into the fact that it doesn't matter how big you are or indeed how small you are. If you've got something of value, then cyber criminals will target you. Going through 2022, what did we see? We also saw healthcare being targeted. I think unfortunately that's an area we're going to see again coming under attack in 2023. Why? Mainly because it's something of a soft target. You know, if you're going to spend a significant amount of money in that particular space, you probably aren't going to be prioritizing security over health services. We're also going to see not just ransomware, but we're going to see data being stolen. Marriott has appeared now in a number of different sessions that I've done over the past quite a few years actually. But we did see just this year a third attack, a third exfiltration of significant amounts of data from Marriott. And I think that trend of stealing data So a network intrusion for the theft of it, maybe that you don't use straight away. Maybe you store up and then sell on the dark web at some point in the future, is probably something that we're going to see very much more of. So the value of data obviously is going to be quite significant as we continue to produce it at a fairly exponential rate. But it's not just private sector. We saw public sectors as well in 2022 come under attack. I think this really does shine a light on the fact that it doesn't actually matter whether you're in the public or the private sector. If you have information, or if you are providing a level of service, or if a nation state is looking to attack your environment, then certainly it's an area that we'll see increasing. And it won't just be ransomware. The example here, of course, is the Conti ransomware attack that was in Costa Rica. But it isn't going to be confined to ransomware, unfortunately. And then we've also seen drone-based intrusion. Now, those of you who are ISF members, and I know there are a number of you listening into this, will know that we've been talking about drones through our Threat Horizon program for quite some while. In fact, those of you that also participate in our cyber simulation exercises will know that we use a drone environment there as an example of some of the things that can go wrong during an attack. And we're seeing more of that, using them as listening devices in particular. So all of that is going to become a feature, I think, of 2023. The one thing that is slightly different is that I do think we're going to move as well from crime as a service, ransomware as a service, into more seeing the rise of the cyber mercenary. So people for hire who will actually help you carry out some of these attacks. Now, of course, we saw some of that in terms of nation state sponsored through third parties so that they could deny that they'd actually been behind the attacks. But I think the cyber mercenary is probably a little bit new. So what can we do? Well, other than patching, other than policies, other than processes, other than making sure that our people are fully trained and aware, what smart organizations are doing is really playing out their incident response to these kinds of incidents. And there's a little quote down there in the bottom of the slide that you can see, taken from, not from the ISF, but from Ponemon, who are looking at the cost of a data breach. And you can see there's quite a significant amount of money to be saved from those organizations that had gone through an incident response program, so had a plan that was ready to go when an attack took place, versus those that perhaps hadn't done so. So cyber attacks, certainly on the agenda in 2022, going to continue in 2023. The second thing that I think we're going to see is a little shift in supply chain. Now, again, from an ISF standpoint, we've been talking about supply chain security for quite a number of years. And I think the supply chain has probably been something that businesses have viewed as being on the business side of the house as opposed to on the security. So we've started to see more in 2022, a blending of that. I think the pandemic really shone a light on it because some of the suppliers that people were using, of course, were simply no longer there. They'd gone out of business. But there's an interesting trend I think we're going to see in 2023 emerging, which is that as more businesses move their infrastructure to third parties, I'm thinking in particular of things like cloud, for instance, or multi-cloud environments, combination of multi-cloud with perhaps 5G, depending on the different locations that you're operating in. As organizations move down that road, there will be a tendency or a temptation perhaps to opt for a one-size-fits-all. And that strategy, that approach, is really going to impact then the flexibility that organizations have, not just to innovate, but to respond to any attacks that might take place. So the issue for me around supply chain in 2023 is really having very much of an eyes-open approach to the way in which we are moving our infrastructure to third parties. Yes, it's all about conducting the right level of diligence in terms of the way that the third party is securing our data, but very much more importantly, I think, it's about leaving our options open so that if we do want to switch providers, if we do want to change the way in which we are perhaps using the third-party infrastructure, we're able to do that. So supply chain is the second one. The third one that really does bother me, actually, is data. So this is the move that we've seen from not just being about confidentiality and availability of data, but the integrity of the data. If you think about the way that businesses are going to be using data very much more over 2023 and indeed beyond, we're going to start to see artificial intelligence coming into its own. We're going to start to see things like predictive analytics coming into their own. Data takes on a new value in that environment because businesses are actually dependent upon the integrity of that data to make decisions. And adversaries, cybercriminals, know that. So I think we're going to start to see very much more concern from the security side in how do we preserve integrity of the information that we're acting upon. Businesses will also, I think, really have to ask questions before they act on that as to whether or not they have a high degree of confidence in the integrity of that data. And one of the questions that immediately springs to mind is, well, what can we do about that? How do we, given that we're producing data so exponentially, given we're producing it in a whole range of different environments, from a home environment, on the go, in the office, how can we ensure the integrity of it? And I think it's about stepping back and actually realizing that not all data that we have across the business needs to be protected 100% of the time. There will probably be certain elements of data, of information, that you would refer to as the crown jewels. So we have to start very much more focusing on the information that is absolutely essential for decision making, for running our businesses, and make sure that we're doing as much as we possibly can to protect that. And that's the starting point. So when we talk about integrity of data, it isn't about trying to boil the ocean. You will never achieve that. You have to start small, you have to be very specific, and the security role is to work really collaboratively with the business in terms of identifying those elements of data, where they are being shared, how secure they are at all stages of the data lifecycle. And if we can do that, then I think some of the problem around integrity will start to go away. But we can't be complacent in it, and that's really why this is one of the biggest challenges I think we're going to face in 2023. And then the last particular threat or challenge is what I've called the never normal. This is about change. This is about the fact that security organizations really, I think, coming out of 2022, going into 2023, were really hoping that they'd be able to draw breath, that they'd be able to sort of recover a little bit from what had been going on through the pandemic and having to be responsive to the way in which business change needed to take place in a very, very fast moving way. And sadly, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to see a number of different things that are continuing to pile up on the CISO's work list, and indeed the list, therefore, of the security department in general. Not least will be the shifting regulatory landscape. We're starting to see very much more regulation moving from being holistic, if I could put it that way, down into being very country-specific. Keeping abreast of all of that really does mean that one of the CISO's best friends next year is going to be the legal department. We're starting to see changes as well around ethical considerations. So ethical collection, ethical storage, ethical use of data. That's going to increase significantly in importance in 2023. And I think that for a number of organizations, that's going to be really challenging. Having to look at where the data is coming from, how you're using it, and then make a statement that people will be expecting you to make publicly around that. So again, a job not just for the Chief Information Security Officer and his or her team, but also for business leaders. And this constant state of change that we're going to see, transformation in all areas of business, really is going to require a very agile security strategy that probably doesn't look out more than about 3 to 6 months, to be quite honest. It is about how we can be flexible, how we can map entirely to the direction that the business is headed in, and how we can try to preserve all of the different pieces of the security pie that are good, that are in line with what the business needs, whilst also adding on top of that so that we are adapting to the way in which the markets are going to be taking us, I think, through what is probably going to be a fairly tough 2023, certainly from an economic and trade standpoint. So those are the four major challenges that I see in 2023. So now let's look at what we can do about that. Well, the first thing for me is really adapting our security strategies to being much more business-based. We have to be supportive of that overall organizational strategy. Now, many Chief Information Security Officers talk to me about the lack of resource that's available, whether that be funding, whether that be people. Life becomes very much easier, I think, if we've got this alignment between a security strategy and a business strategy. Because boards, businesses have already decided on the direction that they want to take the business. And so if we can combine security into that, some of those problems tend to go away. But much more importantly, we have to put in place a strategy that not so much guarantees, but to a certain extent assures resilience. We have to move towards just-in-case planning. We have to adapt some of the ways in which we are putting together our strategies to include scenarios. And those are all going to become essential for a resilient business-based security strategy in 2023 and beyond. And if we're talking about resilience, if we're talking about strategy, then we have to be talking about the board, because boards own those components. So what is it that the CISO needs to be communicating through to the board in 2023? What does the board actually need to know? Well, the answer is that the board actually doesn't need to know very much. Boards really want assurance more than knowledge, and some may say the two are combined, but let's focus on that assurance piece. What is it that they need to feel comfortable about? Well, they want to understand that cybersecurity is actually being treated as a business risk rather than purely an IT technical problem, because the days of it being an IT issue are long gone. Talking to a number of security professionals at our most recent annual Congress in Manchester, one in particular was telling me that the biggest challenge or the biggest change that they had to go through in 2022 was moving out of IT and moving into the Chief Risk Officer's department, because there are a number of different changes there. But in terms of the relevance of security, therefore, to the business, that's a really positive step, I would suggest. So the board needs assurance that cybersecurity is a business risk and being treated as such. Also wants to know that the organization is prepared for whatever comes next, the next unexpected crisis. So situational awareness suddenly takes on a different value, because we have to really understand how dependent we are upon third parties and, come what may, ensure that commercial stability is in place. That means that, yes, of course, we have to focus on basic security measures. The board expects that. So indeed does everybody across the business. Supporting, yes, confidentiality, yes, availability, but also integrity. And there's also a need for assurance at the board level that the most up-to-date, the best, the most appropriate, I would say, risk management methods are being applied. Not just to specific products, but across the business, at the most appropriate levels that are really determined to be valid, appropriate, and necessary. And that applies not just within the organization, but if you think about what I was saying about supply chains, it also means suppliers, and it also, of course, means customers. Fundamentally, what the board is looking for is assurance that the organization is actually resilient. So if we talk about resilience, what does that actually mean? Because quite a few people will very often say to me, well, I hear a lot about cyber resilience, Steve, but what's it look like? How do I become resilient? Well, at the ISF, we have a cyber resilience framework that our members have been using now for quite some while. But in essence, what cyber resilience means is that organizations are prepared to deal with impacts from cyber threats that can't be predicted and indeed may not be able to be prevented. So the first thing that you need there is a solid governance and partnering framework to monitor cyber activities. That has to include the way in which you collaborate with partners, whether those partners be your suppliers or whether they be your customers. And it also has to be in line with the risks and obligations of operating in cyberspace. So very high levels of partnering and collaboration are fundamental to a resilience framework. You also have to have this situational awareness. You need to understand what's going on across your overall corporate landscape, but also in the markets and the different environments. How do you achieve that? Well, if you're an ISF member, of course, then you'll be sharing that kind of information with colleagues at the various events that we run all through the year. If you're not an ISF member, then there are other ways in which you can do that, both public and private partnerships in that space. How you do it isn't so important as the fact that you do it. So you need to have a process for gathering and analysing and sharing cyber intelligence. You also need to have some kind of resilience assessment. You need a process for assessing and adjusting that level of resilience because it's going to change. Because threats will change, the way in which you respond to those threats will change, the maturity of your organisation will change, the value of different assets will change. And so you have to have an ongoing resilience assessment process across the business. And then finally, the fourth leg here is response, of course. You really do need to have thought through how you're going to not just prevent or detect, but more importantly, perhaps respond to some of these incidents that I've been talking about and also minimise the impact. And the two ways I think that you can do that best in 2023 are through scenario planning and incident rehearsal. And certainly if I look at the way in which ISF members are responding in this particular space, those are the two things that I'm seeing being very much more used and that we're working with our members on to try to put in place so that they can anticipate how to respond to impacts that they simply can't forecast. And that's the importance of the scenarios. So a cyber resilience framework is absolutely fundamental, I think, in 2023. So if we've talked about the landscape, we've talked about the different threats, we've talked about some of the ways in which we can look at strategy and frameworks, but what does good actually look like? Well, there needs to be a formal and a frequent place on the board agenda, I would suggest, for addressing cyber risk, because it is not static. It does move, and the board needs to be aware of that. That's the first thing. The second thing is we do need to have pretty well-rehearsed cyber incident response plan that helps to minimize business interruption and losses. It's about understanding and improving on a continuous basis the organization's ability to, yes, respond to cyber attacks, but also to do some of the investigation work afterwards, some of the forensics, to make sure that we can learn from what has happened. The company's risk tolerance is hugely important. It needs to be determined and well understood and clearly defined. And actually that's just the same as any other type of enterprise risk. There is no magic in that. It's hard work. And then the final piece is the linkage between business objectives and strategy and the activities that are required to protect the organization. So the security components. This is that linkage that I was talking about between business strategy and security strategy. It's about identifying the gaps, it's about identifying some of the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses and doing something very positive to address that. So let me leave you with just 4 key focus areas for 2023, and then I'll take some questions from you all. What are the 4 things that you need to be looking at? Well, there are no surprises here. The first, and I've talked about it a lot, is resilience. That for me is the #1 business priority. You have to identify and prioritize your assets, critical assets, as they change in value, as they evolve, and you have to continually improve your breach response capabilities. We have to be looking at a just-in-case environment. We have to be scenario planning. We have to be planning for the day that we hope never comes and really stress testing our response as an organization. The second is in that area of risk management, governance and compliance. It's about having a very sound governance framework so that you can identify changes to regulations as they happen, but only those regulations that are really going to influence your company's risk and security efforts. So again, it's about having a filter, if you like, as to really understand what is important to your organization and when you need to make some of the changes that are necessary given the way that your organization is evolving. You won't have time to do it all. So you have to be very, very selective about the areas that you do focus in. Supply chain. Well, I think we're going to see this one popping up from time to time now over the next few years. But in 2023, certainly we're seeing supply chain risk becoming pretty much all pervasive. And so the onus, I think, on every organization is really to communicate effectively, regularly with key suppliers. It's about reviewing the potential exposure to new threats. Cybercriminals know that one of the best ways into an organization is through its supply chain. Why? Because there are so many small to mid-sized organizations out there, and large ones, that perhaps will provide an easier access route. And we know that that is a well-trodden path. And then finally, it's about people. The world of work has changed. People do expect to work in a different way now. Policies and procedures need to reflect that. But it also, I think, is raising the expectation in terms of management of people. We have to pay special attention to things like cyber fatigue and mental health. We can no longer fall back on the fact that we will see people face to face. We have to adapt and introduce better ways of working with them remotely. Not just so that we can ensure their mental health and that they're doing their best work, but also so that we can monitor insider threats that I think are also potentially on the increase in 2023. So that is all that I have for you in this part of the webinar. What I'm going to do now is take questions from you. Again, for those of you who perhaps joined a little bit late, if you're watching this on playback, not live, those are my details that you can get hold of me if there are any questions that you've got arising from what I've been talking about, or perhaps what I haven't been talking about. Then you can get hold of me in a number of those ways. So thank you for listening to this particular piece of the webinar. And now I'm going to look forward to answering some of your questions. Thanks very much. Okay, so let's see what we've got coming through on the iPad here, if I can get it going. There we are. Right, so some questions. Gosh, there's quite a few coming in here. First one's, let me start with this. What have you seen successful organizations do when instituting a risk-based approach to cybersecurity? Well, I think there's a range of different things there. I think I talked about the fact that it's about developing an approach that is appropriate for your organization, that's in line with your risk appetite, that's in line with your strategy. And I think that really is the real sort of fundamental of it. So successful organizations in that particular space, I think, have got a very clear idea of the relationship between risk and strategy. They have a very clear view as to the role that security plays in mitigating some of those risks. And I think importantly, there is then linkage right from the board through the organisation, through things like operating plans and the way in which organisations generally function through objectives and so on, that ensures that everybody in the enterprise understands how they fit into enabling a successful organisation, which includes that element of risk mitigation. So I don't think it's as simple as one or two different things. I think it is, for some companies, quite transformational, because you do have to change the way in which you communicate, way in which you really equip yourself and the people within the organisation to deal with risk. But that's certainly what I would say to that. Second one here, which is looking at small and mid-sized companies. So the question is, and this one's actually from the UK, it's from a fairly large organisation, so I'm suspecting this is probably some concern around the supply chain element. So it says, to what extent do you think the economic downturn will hinder small to medium-sized companies' investment in security programs? And that is a really tough one. I think that small to mid-sized companies, particularly at the very small end of it, probably don't have dedicated security resource. So do they have dedicated investment in that particular area? Again, probably not. So therefore, what impact is an economic downturn going to have? Inevitably, it's going to make money harder to come by. The good news, I think, is that it should, in most organisations, cause them to focus in very clearly on the key things that they need to do. So some of the things I was talking about, for instance, in terms of identifying critical elements of data, identifying specifically where your risks might be, specifically where some of perhaps your supply chain risks might lie. But I do think going forward that there is a bigger onus on larger organisations to share more, to collaborate more effectively across all of the corporate real estate that includes the extended supply chain. And I would put into that the small and mid-sized organisations. So trying to make something positive out of an economic downturn, hopefully it will cause people to focus in on what really is important and what they absolutely need to focus on in order to get things done effectively. Another one here that's just popped up, which is, what is my view on cyber insurance as a tool to develop cyber resilience? This is where I could get myself into trouble. Cyber insurance. I think cyber insurance is an effective tool in as much as every insurance policy is effective for when things go wrong. I don't know that I would start with cyber insurance as a tool to develop cyber resilience. I would start the other way around. So I would look at cyber resilience and ask myself, where might insurance play an effective role in that? And then what I would do is shop around to get the right insurance to fit my needs rather than doing it differently. Now, cyber insurance, of course, is and continues to be quite an easy sell into the boardroom, because the board understands the need for insurance. They're buying it for all sorts of other things. But I do think it is something of a mistake if we view cyber insurance as a means of enabling us not to do something. So if I buy insurance, I don't need to invest in some of the areas that I was talking about. Maybe it's governance, maybe it's situational awareness, maybe it's that overall assessment. So I think that it's a tool, and like any tool, it's only going to be as effective as how we best use it. Moving on now to something here under the shortage of talent. Here we are. So this one is coming from the United States, and it says, how would you advise addressing the problem a lot of organizations face with a lack of security and compliance staff? I think we have to look at why is there a perceived shortage. And I say perceived because my view, if you like, or my vision for the way that security operates going forward is that we aren't constraining and confining security and compliance just to one particular department. The way to solve some of the resourcing problems is to make sure that business departments are as aware as possible of the role that they need to play in terms of security and compliance. If we adopt that kind of approach, then the role of security becomes very much more one of advising, consulting, and making sure that the business departments are really doing all that they can do in order to be effective in that space. If we come at it from that perspective, then some, not all, of those skill shortages will certainly have a diminished impact on the organisation. But there's quite a few other questions that have come in here, particularly around this issue of talent. And another one here that I'll pick up. This one is from somebody over actually down in Australia. Gosh, I'm not quite sure what time it is down there, but it's not. Must be fairly early or late, depending on which way you look at it, I suppose. Is organisational resistance to employing capable people from outside the industry to blame for a shortage of talent? I don't think we do enough in the industry to encourage people from outside the industry to come in. I think if you look at some of the requirements that, for instance, technical recruiters are putting in place around things like certifications, experience that's required, some of those really are not necessary. If we look to the way that security is evolving, there's a huge demand for some of the softer skills that traditionally perhaps some security people may not have. So that opens the door to a wide variety of people who don't have 15 years experience in technology, for instance. They may be coming at it from a marketing perspective. They may be coming at it from an HR perspective. They may be coming from a completely different industry and retraining. So I think that is one of the ways in which we can address a skill shortage. The other thing that we need to be doing is we need to be making it very, very clear to people through pathways, through apprenticeships, of the route that they can take from school into the industry. And rather than putting barriers in place where they're required to have certain certificates and so on, we need to be taking all of that away and looking at how we can help them to gain the necessary qualifications whilst they're in work. There are a large number of things that we do in security that act as very, very good training grounds for people on apprenticeships that can move into our organisations today. It's not about having to sponsor university scholarships for 3 to 4 years. It is about how we can get people into the profession early on, provide them with a solid career path, and everybody wins. So I think that's the way that we need to look at it. Some other ones in here. What have we got? Okay. One that's related to cyber fatigue. What do I suggest for cyber fatigue being added into the risk register for employees working from home? I think the issue with cyber fatigue is one that we really do need to be aware of. Now, if you're an organisation that has a very large number of people working remotely, it doesn't actually have to be from home, it could be from anywhere that's an environment that you can't monitor on an in-person basis, then there is a risk of cyber fatigue. I think that all too often we have run the risk of focusing too much on input rather than output. I see examples of organisations, for instance, that are setting up click monitoring devices so that you can see whether or not people are actually using their mouse, whether they're at their laptop, all of those sorts of things. And that really does sort of cause me to throw my hands up in despair. Because if you don't trust the people that are working remotely, then you shouldn't have them work remotely. It is very simple. It's not a people problem, it's an organisational issue. You need to really focus on how you can monitor and manage and support people working wherever they happen to be. And that includes really making sure that they're taking the right amount of breaks, that you are aware of some of the challenges that they might be facing. And so I think we will see, going through 2023, a number of organizations considering that people-based issue a little more. A number of HR directors perhaps making sure that training is being provided to managers to spot these kinds of things. Ultimately moving it onto a risk register, I think that again, that's a decision for an organization. You know, if you have a highly distributed workforce that is constantly working remotely, and you're concerned about that and it will have a detrimental impact to your business, then certainly it should find its way onto the risk register. There's no doubt about that. What else have we got here on people? One more on this, then I'll move on to some of the other interesting areas. But this one I quite like as well, and this one's coming from. Let's have a quick look. Where's it from? Yep, this one's from Germany. So the global talent shortage makes it easy for InfoSec folks to skip from job to job, getting a pay and seniority boost each time they move. Is this in danger of creating a workforce of people with thin skills who do not spend enough time at each post to embed important skills? It is a great concern, isn't it? Because you spend, quite an amount of time hunting down the right people that you need to do the job that you're looking for. Average tenure of, say, a chief information security officer is what these days? I don't know, 2 years, something like that, maybe a little bit more if you're lucky. And if you break that down, for instance, then it takes you 3 to 4 months, 5 months maybe to get into the swing of an organization. If you're leaving then, say in a 2-year tenure, you're probably either looking for or being hunted to and working notice for the last 6. So you've got about 12 months where you're effective. And I think that we do need to look at how we can increase the tenure of security professionals, whether it be the CISO, whether it be network security, whatever it is. And the answer to that, again, is not a simple one. It's about understanding what it is that people are looking to achieve when they come into a role. And when I look at it, I try to segment people into those that are perhaps, yes, going to be there for a short period of time because they want to gain a specific set of skills and then they do want to move on. Those that want to stay a little bit longer, and they may have career aspirations that can be met within an organization. Now, what is really important is that at the outset, at the hiring point, there is a completely transparent discussion between both parties as to what they're trying to achieve from that particular hire. And I don't think we do that often enough. So we need to be braver on both sides in terms of the candidate and the employer, in terms of really specifying what we're expecting, what the contract is in terms of what am I going to do for you as an employer to an employee, and vice versa. And then tracking and measuring that throughout the period of engagement between the two parties. Now, for some people listening to this, they'll think I'm completely bonkers and talking nonsense. But I do think that we have reached a point, not just in security, but generally, where the world of work has changed so dramatically that we have to adopt very different approaches to employment. And transparency, for me anyway, is probably the only way that we can go forward. Because if we don't have that, we can't have trust. If we don't have trust, that makes for a very ropey kind of employment contract, and nobody really wins. And what we're trying to do is to achieve a win-win situation. So quite a long answer there to that, but it's something that, as you can probably gather, I feel quite passionately about. Okay, let's move on. What have we got here? This is under the ransomware and sort of cyber exercises. Oh, this is an interesting one. Where's this one coming from? This is another one from Canada, actually. So apart from the IT team, who else should be part of creating a ransomware playbook? The answer to that, in the ideal world, is everyone from the board down. And in fact, IT are probably not the first people that I would look to be involved in that particular playbook development. When I look at the sort of work that we're doing at the ISF with some of our members in terms of establishing playbooks for them, in terms of running response exercises, the ones that are the most detailed and therefore potentially most effective have all started with buy-in from the very top of the organisation, because that demonstrates an understanding of the impact that the attack can have in terms of it being really very debilitating. So you get commitment from the top. As soon as you've got that, life becomes quite a bit easier. So you do want to involve your board. You do want to involve your C-suite. You will involve your marketing department. You will inevitably involve your HR department, because if you think about what happens during an attack, it's all about communication, not just with shareholders, but also with employees and then customers. So you're involving your sales teams as well. So it's pretty much all embracing across the enterprise. And it's about trying to understand the role that each of those different departments has to play, detailing it, putting it into the playbook, and then rehearsing it, and keeping it by the desk, so that when things go wrong, as they will unfortunately, you know where it is. It's no good holding it in the cloud somewhere. You actually, in my opinion, need to have a physical copy that people can put their hand on, because you may not have access to the cloud. If your systems are down, your systems are down. And that's one of the times when you're going to fall back on good old paper. What else have we got in here? Okay, another one, this one's from the UK. How can organisations best defend against social engineering attacks like spearfishing? Lots of that going on, as we know. This really takes us into that whole awareness space, an area that we've really, I think, talked about for years within security. One of the things I think that is very important here, though, is that we adopt much more of a human-centred approach to security. So why is it that spearfishing is effective? Why is it that the targets are prone to clicking on links they shouldn't, reacting to messages that they're getting? And actually that can be both text-based, it can even be voice-based now with phishing. So it's about raising that level of awareness, but putting the person at the centre of that. So helping people to understand when they're most susceptible, for instance, giving them very clear routes as to what they can do if they see something that looks a little bit suspect. You know, how many people actually know what to do? Do you know who to call? Do you know what you should be doing? The answer is not to click and see whether or not anything happens. The answer is to try and prevent people from doing that. And of course, the people who are dropping this kind of potential malware know very well when we're at our lowest points. So it will be on a Friday. It will be towards the end of a day. There may be a degree of urgency that's put into the message that we're having to respond to. So it's all about awareness, it's all about role playing, and it's all about constant reinforcement of the positives with that. So very often, you know, I see organizations that talk about, I spend a lot of time talking about the fact that certain attacks got through. It's also about talking about the times that attacks didn't get through. So really sort of big up and praise the times when people have raised a flag, have talked about the fact that they've had this, they've been targeted, and they've taken a certain course of action, because people will remember that and can relate to those situations far better, I think, than some of the other ways that we've seen about handling awareness. But awareness is certainly something that we're going to see a lot more of, I think, being necessary over 2023, particularly as we continue to work remotely and on the move. Next one here, what do I think about cyber risk quantification? Does it provide additional benefit versus a qualitative approach? Is there an accurate, standardized way to proceed in quantifying cyber risk? Well, my answer to that, of course, is yeah, absolutely. You should be using some of the ISF tools. Kira helps you out in that regard. But more seriously, I do think it is about horses for courses. I think that there is a role for qualitative risk assessment, and there is also a time and a place for quantitative risk assessment. If you're going to go down the quantitative route, then you need to be very clear that you're using the right metrics. So you can't assume that the way that you're dealing with that is the way that your board or your C-suite wants to see it. So there's a lot of work that goes into the preparation for moving down a quantitative risk. Very many CISOs as well don't like it because they feel that it shines a light in the wrong area. If I can't quantify something, does that mean that the risk isn't a real one? And so there's still that preference in some areas for qualitative assessment as well. My own view is that you use both, but you're very circumspect about where you use one approach versus the other, and there is no right or wrong. And I think if you're going to go wholeheartedly into either one of those, then that is probably something of a mistake. Okay, we've got, see time's marching on. I've probably got time for one or two more here. Okay, this one, again from the US. What are some of the pitfalls of linking the CISO role too closely with the priorities of regulatory compliance? Really quick answer to that one. Regulatory compliance, by the very nature of it, tends to look backwards. So it is based on what has happened in the past and therefore development of regulation in order to prevent such an occurrence happening again. It's a very simplistic perspective on it, but let's stick with that. What a CISO has to do is, yes, to pay attention to what's happened in the past, but also to anticipate the future. And so if you are too focused on regulatory compliance, you run the risk of missing out on the future. So I would always encourage people to try and get the balance right. You can't ignore regulatory compliance, but nor can you ignore that forward-looking piece, which is so very, very important. And then I've probably just got time for one more. This one, you speak a lot about partnering and collaboration. Can this include competitors? And the answer I would say to that is yes. Clearly, for a lot of organizations, that's quite difficult. I think in the security space, we've been very fortunate for a number of years where security hasn't been seen as delivering competitive advantage. That has changed. And security can now be seen as something that, for organizations, is a way of differentiating in the market. And so that has, I think, given rise to more concern about should I be sharing some of this information with a competitor or not. But the reality is that appropriately done, not disclosing corporate secrets and that kind of thing, but just talking about the way in which you're dealing with certain security issues, handling an ever-emerging and ever-evolving landscape, sharing concerns about what's happening from perhaps nation state if you're in the critical infrastructure space, all of those sorts of things are certainly, for me anyway, in play when it comes to trying to ensure that your organization is more cyber resilient, is better equipped to deal with a constantly emerging, very, very fast moving landscape. And frankly, the more sharing and collaboration we can get going on, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So that, unfortunately, is all that I've got time for today. Thank you very much indeed for those questions. There's plenty in here that I haven't been able to get to, so my apologies for that. If you do have any questions that you really would like an answer to, then you do have my details. I think they're going to be coming up again at the end of this. You can get hold of me on my ISF email. You can get hold of me via LinkedIn, phone. Be very happy to pick up on any of those issues. Or if you have a view on anything that I've been saying that you want to discuss in more detail, again, very happy to do so. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today. I hope that you found it to be useful. And if you are watching this on playback, Again, don't worry, if you do have questions, happy to pick them up at some point in the future. So thank you very much indeed, and look forward to seeing you all again on another one of our ISF webinars in 2023. Thanks very much.